Welcome to this deep dive, investigating the connection between carbohydrate intake and mortality. You shared a fascinating research article from the Lancet Public Health Journal. It's called Dietary Carbohydrate Intake and Mortality, a prospective cohort study and meta-analysis. This research challenges what we think we know about low-carb diets and gives us some valuable insights into how our food choices affect how long we live.
The research really digs deep into the long-term effects of different carbohydrate intake levels. It looks at how much we eat, the types of carbs, and how these choices ultimately relate to our overall health and lifespan.
The study we're focusing on is called the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities Study, or ARIC study for short. It followed over 15,000 adults between 45 and 64 years old for over 25 years. Researchers used dietary questionnaires to assess how many carbohydrates people were eating and then track them to see what caused their death if they died during the study.
The ERIC study is so valuable because of how long it ran and all the data it gathered. Having that long-term perspective really lets us see how the choices we make about food can affect our health over decades.
And what did they find? Well, it turns out there's a U-shaped relationship between how many carbs you eat and how likely you are to die. Diets with less than 40% of energy from carbs were linked to increased mortality. But so were diets with more than 70% of energy from carbs.
It's like there's a sweet spot in the middle. This goes against the idea that cutting carbs as much as possible is always the healthiest choice. It really shows how going to extremes with any kind of diet can be harmful and highlights the importance of balance.
The study found that a moderate carbohydrate intake, specifically between 50% and 55% of total energy, was associated with the lowest risk of dying.
This supports what we know about the importance of balance. Instead of cutting out entire food groups or drastically restricting one type of nutrient, it seems like focusing on a mix of foods might be the best approach for long-term health.
The study didn't just look at the amount of carbs, though. It also looked at what people were eating to replace those carbs. Interestingly, they found that if people replaced carbs with animal-based sources like meat and dairy, their risk of death went up.
That's a really important point. It's not just about the quantity of what we eat, but also the quality. So it seems that we should prioritize nutrient-rich foods when we make choices about replacing carbs.
And to really make sure their findings were solid, the researchers did a meta-analysis. This means they combined the data from 8 different studies, totaling over 432,000 participants.
A meta-analysis is like looking at the big picture. When we pool information from different studies, it gives us stronger evidence because we're looking at a much larger group of people.
And what did they find? This meta-analysis confirmed the U-shaped relationship between carbohydrate intake and mortality that the ERIC study initially found. What was also interesting is that the study showed that how many carbs people eat on average really varies around the world.
Yeah, you see North American and European studies usually represent the lower end of the carb intake spectrum, while Asian studies tend to represent the higher end. This might be why some past studies have seemed to contradict each other about the best amount of carbs to eat. They might not have taken these regional differences into account.
That makes sense because what people eat is so influenced by where they live and their culture. For instance, in many Asian countries, rice and other grains are a much bigger part of their diet than they are in Western countries.
This is exactly why we need to understand these regional variations. We need to move away from the idea that one diet fits everyone. We need to start tailoring dietary recommendations to different groups of people based on their culture and where they live.
So now that we've seen these findings, what are some possible explanations for them? One thought is that low-carb diets often miss out on some important nutrients that are found in fruits, vegetables, and grains.
It makes sense when you think about it. While low-carb diets might help with weight loss initially, if they're not balanced, they can actually do more harm than good. If you're mostly eating animal protein on a low-carb diet, you could actually be increasing inflammation and oxidative stress in your body.
And on the other end of the spectrum, high carbohydrate diets in some regions might be relying too much on refined carbs, like white rice. This can lead to a high glycemic load, which can have negative effects on your metabolism and increase your risk for chronic diseases.
So it's really not just about the quantity of carbs, but also the quality. Instead of focusing on refined carbs like white rice and white bread, it's much better for your health to choose whole grains, fruits, and vegetables.
Now, of course, we have to remember that this is an observational study, so we can't say for sure that one thing causes another.
Exactly. We can see relationships and patterns, but we can't definitively prove that one thing directly leads to another.
It's also worth noting that what people eat can change over time. So in a study like this, where people were followed for 25 years, there's a chance that their diets might have fluctuated throughout the study.
That's a good point. People's lives change, their preferences change, and all sorts of things can influence what they choose to eat over the years.
To really understand this study, though, we should take a look at the methods they used. The research article goes into great detail about how they analyzed the data. It talks about what variables they considered and how strong their results were.
Understanding how a study was done is really important. It helps us see how the researchers came to their conclusions and whether we can trust their findings.
The researchers used special statistical models to figure out how strong the connection was between carbohydrate intake and the risk of death. They took into account things like age, sex, education level, and lifestyle factors to make sure they were isolating the effects of carbohydrates.
That's really important. They wanted to make sure that the relationship between carbohydrates and mortality wasn't simply due to other factors that might influence both what people eat and their overall health.
And what was really interesting is that even after they adjusted for all these other variables, the U-shaped relationship between carbs and mortality was still there.
That's a strong finding. It means that the connection between carbohydrate intake and mortality isn't just a coincidence. It seems to hold up even after accounting for other potential influences.
To get a clearer picture of the people in this study, the article also tells us about their characteristics at the beginning of the study.
It's really helpful to know things like their age, sex, health status, and lifestyle factors. This helps us understand if the findings of the study might apply to other groups of people as well.
The researchers noticed some interesting trends within the group. For example, people who ate a lower percentage of carbs tended to share certain characteristics.
What kinds of characteristics?
Well, they were more likely to be younger, male, and non-black. They also tended to have higher BMIs, be less physically active, and have higher incomes. And on top of that, they're more likely to smoke cigarettes and have diabetes.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is. Those findings really highlight how complex the relationship is between the choices we make about food and our overall health. It shows that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to giving dietary advice. We really need to take into account each person's individual circumstances and lifestyle.
Now, let's move on to the meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier. Remember, they combined data from 8 different studies, which included lots of different types of people. This gives us a broader view of how carbohydrate intake might be linked to mortality.
A meta-analysis is a powerful tool. By bringing together data from multiple studies, we can really increase the statistical power of the analysis. This means we can be more confident in the results and get a clearer picture of the relationship between carbs and mortality. It's fascinating how this approach can reveal patterns and trends that might not be apparent when looking at individual studies in isolation.
What did this meta-analysis tell us about carbs and mortality?
Well, it basically confirmed what we saw in the ERIC study. That U-shaped relationship between carbohydrate intake and mortality was still there even when we looked at all these different studies together.
So it seems like that sweet spot for carbohydrate intake is something we should be paying attention to.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of balance and moderation in our diets.
But there's more to the story, right? The meta-analysis also revealed that the range of carbohydrate intake in each study was important.
That's right. It turns out that studies where people were eating fewer carbs on average were mainly reflecting the left side of that U-shaped curve. You know, the part where eating fewer carbs is actually linked to a higher risk of death.
So it's not just about blindly cutting carbs, it's about finding that balance point.
Precisely. The specific range of carbohydrate intake that a study looks at can really influence the results.
On the other hand, studies with people eating more carbs on average were mostly showing the right side of the U-shaped curve, where higher carbohydrate intake is associated with increased mortality.
And this supports the idea that going too far in either direction, either too few carbs or too many, can be harmful. It really emphasizes the importance of finding that middle ground.
It seems like balance is a key theme emerging from this research.
Balance and moderation seem to be crucial for long-term health. Instead of focusing on extremes, it seems like a more balanced approach to eating might be the best way to go.
This meta-analysis didn't stop at just looking at the amount of carbs, though, did it? They also looked at what people were eating to replace those carbs, right?
That's right. They found that when people swapped out carbs for fat and protein from animal sources, their risk of dying actually increased.
This brings us back to that idea of food quality being just as important as quantity.
It's not enough to just count carbs or calories. We really need to think about the types of foods we're choosing and where those nutrients are coming from.
Can you give us some specifics about what those food sources were?
Sure. The people who were eating more animal-based fat and protein were eating more things like beef, pork, lamb, chicken, and cheese.
These are foods that are pretty common in a lot of Western diets.
Exactly. And they tend to be high in saturated fat and cholesterol, which have been linked to a whole range of health problems like heart disease and certain cancers.
What about the people who replaced carbs with plant-based fat and protein?
They were eating more things like nuts, peanut butter, dark bread, grain bread, chocolate, and white bread.
It's interesting to see those specific foods listed.
It gives us a clearer picture of what those dietary patterns actually look like.
There was another observation in the study that I found interesting. They noted that people who were eating low-carb diets, regardless of whether they were animal-based or plant-based, tended to drink fewer sugary drinks.
That's a good thing. We know that sugary drinks are bad news for our health. They've been linked to obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and all sorts of other problems.
So even if people are following a low-carb diet, if they're cutting out sugary drinks, that's still a positive step.
Absolutely. Any reduction in sugary drink consumption is a win for our health.
This study has some pretty big implications for the dietary recommendations that were given, don't you think? It seems to suggest that the advice to eat low-fat diets, high in carbohydrates, might not be the best approach for everyone.
It's definitely a challenge to the conventional wisdom about what a healthy diet should look like. We need to move away from these rigid guidelines and start thinking about individual needs and preferences.
We need to acknowledge that what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to diet.
This study emphasizes that point so clearly. It highlights the importance of personalized nutrition advice.
Instead of blindly following generic guidelines, people should work with healthcare professionals to create a dietary plan that's tailored to their unique circumstances and goals.
It's all about finding what works best for each individual.
That's the key to long-term success and well-being.
So what's the bottom line here? What kind of diet does this study suggest is best for our health?
It seems like a balanced diet with a moderate amount of carbohydrates is the way to go. And importantly, we should be focusing on plant-based sources of fat and protein.
This aligns with a lot of the current thinking in nutrition.
There's a growing emphasis on the importance of eating whole, unprocessed foods, especially from plants.
And when we think about it, it makes sense. A diet rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains provides us with such a wide range of nutrients that our bodies need.
It's not just about preventing disease, it's about promoting overall health and vitality.
Of course, we have to acknowledge that this study has limitations.
Like any research, it's important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the study so we can interpret the findings appropriately.
As we've mentioned, this is an observational study, so we can't say for sure that one thing causes another.
Right. We can see associations and patterns, but we can't definitively prove cause and effect.
And there's always the possibility that people's diets might have changed over the 25 years of this study.
It's true. We can't account for every single dietary change that might have happened over that time period.
And there's always some degree of error in how people report what they eat.
Even with the best tools and methods, it's impossible to capture dietary intake perfectly.
But despite these limitations, this study offers some really valuable insights.
The large sample size, the long follow-up period, and the robust statistical analysis help to mitigate those limitations to a certain extent.
So we can still learn a lot from this research.
Absolutely. This study adds to our understanding of the complex relationship between what we eat and how long we live. And it highlights the need for a more nuanced and individualized approach to nutrition advice.
To get a better grasp on the reliability of this study, let's take a deeper look at its methodology.
It's important to critically evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of any study. This helps us understand how much weight to give to the findings and how they might apply to the real world.
One of the biggest strengths of this study is its sheer size.
With over 15,000 participants, this study had a lot of statistical power.
What does that mean exactly?
Basically, it means that the findings are less likely to be due to chance. With a larger sample size, we can be more confident that the observed relationships are actually meaningful.
Another strength is the long follow-up period, right? 25 years is a really long time to track people's health.
It is, and that's really valuable when we're studying chronic diseases. These diseases develop over many years, so a long follow-up period gives us a much better understanding of how diet might contribute to their development.
The researchers also collected a ton of information on the participants.
They didn't just look at what people were eating. They gathered information on their demographics, health status, lifestyle factors, and even their dietary habits.
Having all that data
Yeah.
allowed the researchers to really dig deep into the relationship between carbohydrate intake and mortality.
They could control for all sorts of potential confounding factors. This helps us be more certain that the observed relationship between carbs and mortality wasn't simply due to something else.
The researchers were very thorough in their statistical analysis, too.
They used sophisticated methods to analyze the data and carefully adjusted for potential confounding variables.
This level of rigor really adds credibility to their findings.
Absolutely. It gives us confidence that the observed U-shaped relationship between carbohydrate intake and mortality is robust.
But, like you said, no study is perfect. This one has its limitations, too.
Every study has its strengths and weaknesses. It's important to acknowledge those limitations so we can interpret the findings appropriately.
One of the main limitations of this study is that it relied on people self-reporting their dietary intake.
People had to remember and report what they ate, which isn't always accurate. There's always the possibility of recall bias and some degree of measurement error.
Another limitation is that the study didn't track changes in people's diets over time.
We know that people's eating habits can fluctuate, so not accounting for those changes could introduce some bias into the findings.
It would have been ideal to have repeated dietary assessments throughout the study to capture those changes.
That would give us a more dynamic picture of how carbohydrate intake might be related to health over time.
There's another limitation that's worth noting. The study didn't distinguish between different types of carbohydrates.
Right. They didn't differentiate between simple and complex carbs or refined and unrefined carbs.
Those distinctions might be important when it comes to health outcomes.
We know that not all carbs are created equal. Some types of carbs are much healthier than others.
It would have been helpful to have more specific information on the types of carbs people were eating.
Absolutely. It would give us a more nuanced understanding of how different types of carbs might be related to mortality.
And, of course, we have to remember that this study was conducted in the United States.
What we eat and how we think about food varies so much around the world.
So we can't necessarily assume that these findings would apply to other populations.
That's a good point. We need more research in diverse populations to really understand how carbohydrate intake and mortality might be related in different parts of the world.
So while this study has limitations, it also has some very compelling strengths.
The large sample size, the long follow-up period, the comprehensive data collection, and the rigorous statistical analysis make this a really valuable contribution to the field of nutrition research.
It gives us a lot to think about when it comes to our own dietary choices.
It highlights the importance of balance, moderation, and quality when it comes to carbohydrates.
And it reinforces the need for personalized dietary advice.
We need to move away from one-size-fits-all recommendations and start considering individual needs and preferences.
The researchers themselves acknowledge that more research is needed.
There's still a lot we don't know about the complex relationship between carbohydrate intake and mortality.
What are some areas where future research could be particularly valuable?
It would be helpful to have studies that track changes in dietary intake over time. We need to understand how people's eating habits evolve and how those changes might affect their health.
It would also be valuable to differentiate between specific types of carbohydrates.
We need to know more about how simple versus complex carbs and refined versus unrefined carbs relate to health outcomes.
And we need more research in diverse populations around the world.
We need to see if the findings from this study hold up in other cultural contexts.
This study has implications beyond the research world, though, doesn't it? It has potential to influence public health policy and clinical practice.
Absolutely. The findings from this study challenge the way we traditionally think about dietary recommendations.
It seems like we need to move away from these blanket statements about low-fat diets and start promoting a more individualized approach to nutrition.
We need guidelines that are tailored to individual needs, preferences, and health conditions.
Healthcare professionals have a crucial role to play here.
They need to stay informed about the latest scientific evidence regarding carbohydrate intake, and they need to be able to provide evidence-based guidance to their patients.
It's not just about giving generic advice anymore.
It's about working with each patient to develop a personalized plan that helps them achieve their health goals.
This study also has implications for the food industry.
Food labels could be more transparent about the types and sources of carbohydrates in their products.
It would empower consumers to make more informed choices about the foods they're buying.
Clear and accurate labeling could help people select products that align with their dietary goals.
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about what this research means for individuals. What can people do to optimize their carbohydrate intake? based on these findings?
The study provides some practical guidance that people can use to make healthier choices.
The most important takeaway is the importance of moderation.
Both extremes of carbohydrate intake, whether it's very low carb or very high carb, have been linked to a higher risk of death.
So finding that sweet spot in the middle seems to be the key.
It's about finding a balance that works for your individual needs and preferences.
And it's not just about the amount of carbs we eat.
It's also about where those carbs are coming from.
Plant-based carbohydrates seem to be the healthier choice.
Think fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains.
These foods are packed with nutrients and fiber, and they've been linked to a lower risk of chronic diseases. So what are some practical steps people can take to incorporate these findings into their lives?
Start by making gradual changes to your diet. You don't have to overhaul everything overnight.
Small, consistent changes can make a big difference over time.
Absolutely. Start by swapping out refined grains for whole grains. Choose whole wheat bread instead of white bread, brown rice instead of white rice, and quinoa or oats instead of processed cereals.
What about fruits and vegetables?
Load up on those. Aim for at least 5 servings a day.
What about protein?
Explore plant-based protein sources like beans, lentils, tofu, tempeh, and edamame.
These are great alternatives to meat, and they're packed with nutrients.
You can also reduce your portion sizes. Try using smaller plates and bowls and being mindful of how much you're serving yourself.
And don't forget about snacks.
Choose healthy snacks like nuts, seeds, fruit, or plain yogurt instead of processed snacks.
Planning your meals and snacks in advance can also be really helpful.
It can help you avoid making unhealthy choices when you're hungry or short on time.
And try to cook more meals at home.
That way you have more control over the ingredients and portion sizes.
Making changes to your diet can be challenging.
It's important to be patient with yourself and not get discouraged if you slip up.
What are some common challenges people might face?
One of the biggest challenges is cravings. Those cravings for sugary and processed foods can be really strong.
What can people do to overcome those cravings?
Gradually reducing your sugar intake can help. As you eat less sugar, your taste buds will adjust and those cravings will become less intense.
What about social situations? It can be tough to stick to your dietary goals when you're surrounded by unhealthy food choices.
Planning ahead can help. If you know you're going to be in a situation where there will be tempting foods, bring a healthy dish to share or look at the menu ahead of time and choose a healthier option.
What if someone's really short on time? It can be hard to find the time to cook healthy meals when you're busy.
There are definitely strategies for that. You can batch cook on the weekends, prepare meals in advance, or utilize convenience foods like pre-cut vegetables and frozen fruits.
It's all about finding ways to make healthy eating work for your lifestyle.
Exactly. There's no one right way to do it.
It's about finding what works for you and being consistent.
Remember, it's not about perfection, it's about progress.
Let's talk about some common misconceptions surrounding carbs.
There's a lot of misinformation out there, and it can be hard to separate fact from fiction.
What are some of the most common myths you've encountered?
One of the biggest myths is that all carbs are bad for you. That's simply not true. Carbohydrates are an essential nutrient that our bodies need for energy.
It's all about choosing the right types of carbs.
We should be focusing on whole, unprocessed carbs like fruits, vegetables, and whole grains.
Another common misconception is that low-carb diets are the only way to lose weight.
While low-carb diets can be effective for weight loss, they're not the only option. And they're not necessarily the best option for everyone.
Weight loss is about creating a calorie deficit, which can be achieved through a variety of dietary approaches.
It's about finding a sustainable way of eating that works for you long-term.
Another myth is that carbohydrates cause inflammation.
This is a bit of an oversimplification. While refined carbs and added sugars can contribute to inflammation, that's not true for all carbs.
Whole, unprocessed carbs can actually have anti-inflammatory properties.
It's about making distinctions between different types of carbs.
Let's wrap up this discussion with some practical tips for incorporating the study's findings into everyday life.
We've talked about a lot of information, so let's distill it down to some actionable steps.
What are some of the key things people can do to improve their carbohydrate intake?
The most important thing is to focus on quality. Choose whole, unprocessed carbohydrates over refined carbohydrates.
That means swapping white bread for whole wheat bread, white rice for brown rice, and sugary cereals for oatmeal or whole grain cereal.
Absolutely. Make fruits, vegetables, and legumes a regular part of your diet.
These foods are packed with nutrients and fiber, and they're naturally low in calories.
You can also experiment with different types of grains like quinoa, barley, and farro.
And don't be afraid to get creative in the kitchen.
There are so many delicious and satisfying ways to incorporate healthy carbs into your meals.
If you're looking for more personalized guidance,
It's always a good idea to consult with a registered dietitian or a qualified healthcare professional.
well, they can help you create a meal plan that's tailored to your individual needs and goals.
It's all about finding what works best for you and supporting your long-term health and well-being.
Now that we have a better grasp of the science, let's get practical. Can you give us some real-world examples of how to actually put these recommendations into action?
Absolutely. Let's start with breakfast. Instead of reaching for that sugary cereal, how about a hearty bowl of oatmeal topped with some fresh berries and a sprinkle of nuts?
That sounds delicious and filling.
It is, and it's a great way to start your day with those complex carbs, fiber, and healthy fats that'll keep you going strong.
What about lunch?
Instead of a sandwich on white bread, try a big, colorful salad with some grilled chicken or chickpeas for protein.
I love a good salad.
Me too. And you can really pack in the nutrients with lots of leafy greens and different colored veggies. Just use a light vinaigrette for dressing.
Sounds perfect. What about dinner?
For dinner, let's ditch that white rice or pasta and go for quinoa or brown rice instead.
Those are great swaps.
And don't forget a generous helping of steamed or roasted veggies. For protein, you could have fish, tofu, or even lentils.
These are some great ideas. It seems like the key takeaway here is to really focus on whole, unprocessed foods, especially those plant-based options.
That's a great way to sum it up. Eating healthy doesn't have to be boring or restrictive. There are so many delicious and satisfying ways to nourish your body and support your health.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone listening to really think about their own dietary habits. Where can you make some improvements?
Even small changes can make a big difference in the long run.
We've seen that a balanced approach to carbohydrate intake, focusing on quality over quantity, can really have a positive impact on our health and longevity.
It's about making informed choices that nourish our bodies and support our overall well-being.
This deep dive is packed with information. I hope everyone listening feels empowered to take what they've learned and apply it to their own lives.
Nutrition is a fascinating and constantly evolving field. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making choices that support your health and happiness.